Hello and welcome to the 2024 MIFF Schools program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On behalf of MIFF, we believe in celebrating the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the film texts to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCA, and to subjects such as English, EAL, Literature, Media Studies, and to the Film Study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those courses, there is this key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts. And this is obviously a key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. And so for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not necessarily as a replacement or a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements. While the MIFF Schools program is ideally suited to students within French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and German language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. And so given the importance of visual literacy across a range of subjects, I'd recommend that prior to attending the screening, that teachers introduce or revise some key terminology and film techniques to outline the elements of the text that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, films are fun, but there's also an expectation that they'll be analysing those films, whether as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, Media or Film Studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but a general overview of film techniques would be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether on YouTube or in textbook form. But I would also emphasize from the outset that it's crucially important that students can first identify the technique, secondly, that they can understand its general function in creating meaning within the film, and thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge and that terminology to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film is exploring. And it's really difficult to achieve that final outcome unless the first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, so the use, for example, of a close-up shot or a wide-angle shot or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, so basically everything that goes within the frame, the use of props, costumes, lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, things like music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, voiceover, the use of editing, narrative structure, the story elements within the narrative, and to things like visual motifs and symbolism. So as I mentioned, these basic building blocks of film language are really essential to establish pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, which is almost always less effective. And so depending on the age group or the academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students with a particular technique or element of the film to be on the lookout for, to report back in the post-screening classroom discussion, so that they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once, especially if these are students who might not have a lot of experience with film analysis. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the film in more detail now. I should mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the film, while still providing an overview of aspects for analysis that might help structure classroom discussion. Winners is a German coming-of-age sports drama comedy about an 11-year-old Syrian refugee named Mona, whose family has recently arrived in Berlin, where she's struggling to fit in to her new school. She's picked on by her peers, she's yearning for home, and Mona stumbles upon an upcoming soccer tournament where her football skills might be just the ticket to proving herself to her new classmates and teachers. Drawing on her own life, writer-director Soline Youssef's film provides an often light-hearted reflection on the migrant experience, where the classroom becomes a kind of microcosm of the social, political, and cultural issues often facing new arrivals, and those on the socio-economic fringes of society. So just to provide an overview of some of the key themes and ideas that are explored within Winners, you have themes connected to immigration, to the refugee experience, to family and community, to the role of education, and maybe the inequalities within that. I'll sort of touch on that a little bit later on. To themes of bullying, these questions of what does it mean to win? Do you have to be first place to be a winner? What does it mean to learn from defeat? Is that a more valuable experience in some ways? Questions of teamwork and friendship, and to the impact of war, both on a individual, personal level, but also on a broader social or cultural level. Now, I often find it really useful when approaching a film text with a class to start from the outside with the big picture and then gradually work into the sort of the detailed scenic analysis. And I do that because I think it's really important that students understand that art and cinema isn't created in a vacuum. It's responding to its own cultural and historical moment, whether intentionally or unconsciously. And so placing a film in its various social, cultural, historical contexts is often a helpful starting point to having students understand the text on those deeper levels. And so here's some of the contexts that I think you could engage with the film, obviously through the lens of immigration, Syrian immigration within Germany, so the very specific cultural context. But equally, I think you could use the film as a springboard to discuss the experience or a comparative experience of Australian Syrian refugees. If students don't have a familiarity with the issues surrounding refugees and the Syrian civil war, that would be another element to pursue. Also, the specific socio-geographic context in which this film is taking place in the region of Wedding within Berlin itself, which might provide a deeper understanding for the kind of particular world that Mona and her family have found themselves in. I think one of the strengths of this film as another sort of context or springboard is questions about women in sport. Again, you could look at that through the lens of a German perspective or bring it back to an Australian context. These issues of gender inequality in sport and how women's sport is treated, say, in the media differently to men's sport. And also the questions about education within the film. Education and inequality. Another context that you could approach this film from is through the film's production background. And here, I think interviews with the director or other people associated with the film's production might enhance students' understanding of the creative process or the director's intentions for the film. Now, I always sort of tell students that a writer or a director's intentions for a film aren't the only way of understanding a film text, but they often provide a useful springboard. Did we see the film the way they intended it? Might we understand the film differently, knowing more about what the director intended? And here is an excerpt from an interview with Solein Youssef, the writer-director of the film, in which she explains, "I like to create magic in realism. Authenticity is a must, but I also like poetic storytelling and feel at home in tragicomedy. That also fits with my identity. Kurds are extremely humorous people, despite the tragedies that still happen to them today. I can write funny, light-hearted things well, but there's always a seriousness and depth because of my biography. I want to tell the story of each character on an equal level with the greatest authenticity and as dense and humane as possible, and always be entertaining." So, does that come through? Or did that come through in the students' experience of the film? Or does that, perhaps having an awareness of the interplay of stylistic, say, realism with sort of the more humorous approach, how does that shift an audience's awareness, or this connection to her Kurdish identity? And again, that's been translated from the German, so German language students could actually translate the excerpts from the wider interview, and I've listed the link there via the Berlinale website. But there's another interview on Cine Europa, which I think is in English from memory, that students could also refer to. Another approach could be to look at the film through the lens of genre. And here we have, I guess, broadly speaking, a coming-of-age film. So Winners can be approached through the lens of the coming-of-age film, the sports film, or narratives dealing with the immigrant experience. So asking students to think of films or TV shows they're familiar with that deal with a kind of coming-of-age, a key moment of transition in adolescence or teenhood. What are some points of connection between Mona's story in this film and those other coming-of-age narratives that they might have seen, that they might be familiar with? What elements or tropes does Winners borrow from other genres, such as the sports film? For example, the underdog tale, or films about refugees, through themes of, say, discrimination. In what ways might this film differ from those more traditional genre narratives? So here you're trying to really find a point of connection between the students' own viewing experiences and how they relate to this one. Okay, so moving on to the nuts and bolts of film analysis with the techniques that I outlined or mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And this is where, again, it's really crucial that students be able to identify the technique, have a basic understanding of its function, and then be able to analyze the way in which it's being used or employed to create a meaning within the film, whether at the level of themes or characters or the broader narrative function. So, for instance, the close-up, a technique that's used to create an intimate connection between the character and the audience, to emphasize the character's emotional state, or if it's not a character, to emphasize key details within the frame. By contrast, the wide-angle shot, and in this case we have a high-angle wide-angle shot. Why might the director have used this particular shot at this moment? Is it to emphasize the world the character inhabits, the setting, or maybe it's to dramatize, given how small the character is shown within that frame, their sense of isolation, their lack of power, their lack of status in that particular moment. So again, context is really crucial here. And that's why it's important that students have a basic understanding of technique, but also are able to adapt that to the particular context, the scene or sequence in which that technique, that shot, is being employed within the film. Two other sort of fairly traditional or basic techniques, the high-angle shot and the low-angle shot. So as I've sort of intimated through the wide-angle shot, high-angle shot, where the camera looks down on characters, tends to diminish their sense of power, their status. Whereas the low-angle shot, like we see here with this shot of Mona in her sort of brief hero moment early on within the film, dramatizes or exaggerates her sense of status, her power, because she sort of dominates the frame. We're looking up at her in that moment. So again, there's a constant interplay where characters are framed through the camera that changes the audience's understanding and relationship to those characters, both in those instances and across the narrative more broadly. So some of the other techniques that this film uses, and again, these would be prompts for students to really consider how the filmmaker's use of certain angles, techniques, or compositions creates that connection or fosters that connection with the audience or contributes to the exploration of various themes within the film, such as Mona's isolation. So here we have techniques like the direct-to-camera address, where Mona turns, breaks the fourth wall, and acknowledges the presence of the audience, acknowledges that this is a film and I'm talking directly to you now. Why might the filmmaker have chosen to take this particular approach? How does that shape or change the audience's relationship to her character, as opposed to, say, if there wasn't that fourth wall break, if we were just watching her story as sort of distant onlookers? The filmmaker also uses point of view shots, so where the camera literally adopts Mona's perspective in a couple of moments, or through things like the use of split screen, where we have two images or sequences playing out at the same time. And maybe what does that suggest in terms of the connection back to the sort of the war that breaks out between the genders within the film, between the boys' team and the girls' team, having them side by side, divided by this thick black line. Again, the use of certain techniques connects back to themes and ideas that the film is exploring. Or the sudden shift from colour to black and white at one particular key moment within the film. Or the use of costuming. How does costuming define character? And again, there's an interesting reference made to costuming in contrast between Mona's team and some of the other school teams that they're going up against, where one of her teammates mentions, yeah, and we have these crappy shirts. What does that tell us about where this team's coming from and their perception of this team, or their perception of themselves, really, as well? And also the use of the tilt, where the angle of the camera tilts to the left or the right. And this is a technique often used by filmmakers to suggest a world out of balance. As an audience now, we're seeing the world being sort of skewed in a way, which I think, is certainly the case for the particular scene in which the filmmaker's using the tilt in this moment. So what you're aiming for here really is to put students in the mindset of actively thinking about what they're watching and how various meanings are being communicated, often without us being consciously aware of it. And mise-en-scène is a really great approach, I think, to take in terms of that. So how does the filmmaker use the various components of the visual design, lighting, composition, production elements such as props or costumes, to explore or convey aspects related to theme or character? How are various spaces contrasted visually within the film? So, for example, Mona's bedroom. What does the design of that space tell us about her character without needing to resort to dialogue? Does it give us information about her status as a refugee, or her socioeconomic status, or her hopes and desires? We get a close-up of her sister in that space, and we see all these butterflies on the wall. What's the sort of symbolism, perhaps, that's being played out there? The schoolyard with the graffiti. Again, what are the implications that are being played out through the decision that's been made by the filmmaker to establish this as the schoolyard milieu, the schoolyard environment, and the interior of the school, the chaos that emerges at key moments within the film? And you could take this approach to any scene or sequence within the film, whether it's the train station or whether, again, this high-angle, wide-angle shot outside of Mona's apartment, where we have a different kind of graffiti. So again, the filmmaker using mise-en-scène or elements within the mise-en-scène to create and contrast these moments within the film, say from the schoolyard in the early scenes to one of these later scenes within the film. The structure of the film is also, I think, important, specifically the use of flashbacks that we see throughout the film. So the film does give us this series of flashbacks to Mona's former life, and students should really consider, how do these scenes contribute to our understanding of characters? Why might the director have chosen to integrate them in this way? What do they reveal to us about her character over the course of the film? Sort of drip-feeding information. And again, Mona continues with the direct-to-camera address in these flashback sequences. Now, the director, Soline Youssef, actually engages with this particular question in the Cine Europa interview that I referenced a few slides back. And she says, "I wanted to show that there was a world in which Mona felt good. She's a child who doesn't want to flee, just like her parents, because they actually love their homeland, but they're forced to run away. Her home is a beautiful place with a community, a house, a garden. Even if it doesn't look like Germany, it was a place of safety for the family, and they were torn away from it. I didn't want any cliched images. Boys and girls often play football together on the street. There's no such separation between the sexes, just like there isn't any at home. I also wanted to avoid the common kinds of images of war. There is life there. There is family and love. It's not just all piles of rubble. It's a place of longing for the main character. The sun shines differently there. It's bright and warm. Compared to Berlin, it's brighter. I wanted to show that contrast. The flashbacks were meant to look like a photo album. They're so big in her head and in her heart that these images are just naturally embellished. They're always told from her perspective. And I think you get a really keen insight in that excerpt from that interview and the interview more broadly about the kinds of intentions that she had for the film. And again, linking this back to issues like lighting and mise-en-scène and the visual design of the film more broadly, which, as she's elaborating, are clearly connected to the themes and issues and ideas that the film is exploring. So some of these other key themes that I've touched on earlier in the presentation. So the refugee experience. What does the film present as being some of the key struggles and obstacles associated with Mona's status as a refugee? In terms of language, why might the filmmaker have chosen to represent Mona's fluency with German in that particular way? There's a great scene very early on where she's speaking fluent German and then turns to the camera and says, "I forgot to mention, in my head, everyone speaks perfect German." And then we get this brief moment where we see how she's actually speaking German to one of her teachers in this sort of stilted, broken German. And it's a really interesting decision to present her fluency with German, but also acknowledging that this is not really her situation. And I think it would be a great springboard for discussion in terms of the importance of representation and why perhaps migrants are often presented in films with this sort of the broken pidgin English and how kind of demeaning that can be in many ways, even if it's, like Mona acknowledges, a reflection of their struggles at the level of language. So again, there are certain techniques that the filmmaker's using, very conscious of representation here. So definitely something that I think would provoke interesting classroom discussion. We also have references to other migrants and immigrations. You know, the fact that Mona's school teacher, Mr. Chapovsky, says, "Oh, it's a bit hard to say, just call me Mr. Che." So again, there's sort of references to other waves of migration within the film. And that's certainly the case for some of Mona's classmates as well. The theme of education, I think, is another really prominent one throughout the film. So prompting students to consider, in what ways does the film reflect upon the function and value of education and learning within the film? How are the various teachers presented? And what challenges exist within the classroom setting for Mona, her classmates, and also the teaching and administration staff? And this is certainly where I think you could introduce or link this back to inequalities and socioeconomic inequalities within the education system, either in Germany or back in Australia. There's a really key scene, I think, which would provide ample scope for discussion, and that's one in which a teacher makes potentially an innocent offhand comment to one of the students, which the students then pick up on. And it has to do with the expectations that she has for various students. As one of the students responds, "Why is a 4- good for Mona, but a 3+ is bad for Nadine?" And the classroom setting suddenly devolves into a very heated, very passionate back and forth between the students and the teacher. Now, what I think is really great about this particular sequence, and why I think it'd be worthwhile coming back to in the post-screening discussion, is that it lends itself to reading from both sides. I think to a degree we can be sympathetic with the teacher and critical of the students and their sort of knee-jerk reaction and their anger and, you know, the way it taps into outrage culture or cancel culture where, like, that's it, you're racist, we need a new teacher. But also, at the same time, the film, I think, lends itself to a very sympathetic understanding of the students and where they're coming from, that this teacher has these implicit or inherent or unconscious biases that are played out through ethnicity or socioeconomic or race that she has in terms of the standards for each of the students, and that their response is very much justified. So in that sense, the classroom really does become this kind of microcosm of the wider social and cultural issues and conflicts facing Germany and abroad. Similarly, I think you could look at the theme of football, or the way that sport becomes its own sort of microcosm of life. So in what ways does the sporting field also serve as a microcosm of wider social and cultural issues and conflicts, such as gender, racial, economic inequality, and discrimination? How might the film employ sport as a metaphor for confronting or overcoming many of those obstacles? What underlies Mona's particular attachment to football? That, again, I think is borne out gradually in and through those flashback sequences. And like Yusuf says, again, in that interview I referred to moments ago, for me back then, as for my main character, football was a gateway to arriving in Germany, finding friends and getting a spot on the team. Besides, football is a metaphor for life. You fight and you learn to not give up, and you realize that you can win even if you're one of society's losers. I think that's a great prompt for a student discussion about the film. We have the theme of family. Certainly, in what ways does the film suggest that the issues facing Mona are not exclusive to refugee families or immigrants? How do the issues facing Harry, who's a student who's also being picked on within the film, and he happens to be the son of one of Mona's teachers, Mr. Che, how do the issues facing Harry compare to the ones facing Mona and her family? Are the pressures the same? Why might the filmmaker have chosen to foreground the private lives of these two seemingly contrasting characters? I think in terms of visual motifs and symbolism, the presence of lions, or the references to lions, and the presence of mirrors throughout are also worth considering. What kinds of cultural meanings and symbolism are associated with the figure or the creature of the lion? How does the connection to Syria inflect our understanding of the lion and Mona's attachment to it? At one point, she's staring at herself in a mirror saying, "You're a lion." And Harry comes in and says, "Hang on, lioness, not lion, lioness." So the motif becomes associated or tied up with, say, gender inequality and discrimination. And we have in one of her flashbacks, her aunt telling her a lion is a lion no matter what. The film also makes direct reference to Al-Assad, Assad meaning lion. So there's another specific connection there back to Syria and its deeper symbolic and cultural and political meanings. And of course, the mirrors more broadly. In a film that's a coming-of-age film, this is a common trope that connects us to questions of identity and maturity and image and appearances and discrimination as well. The film also contains a number of other cultural references and ideas that could be drawn on in the classroom analysis and discussion. There's a reference and a joke, an in-joke in the film to Rama, which is a German margarine. I think students will probably understand even if they don't get the specific reference, but that's certainly something you could follow up in class. There's the reference to the Zagruta, the celebratory noise with connections to the Middle East. You have nods to the role of media and how conflicts like the one in Syria are presented, say differently within a German context potentially. There are broader questions about dictatorships and democracy. There are nods to food and multiculturalism. We also have multiple languages spoken within the film, not just German, obviously, but Arabic and Portuguese, etc. as well. So a number of avenues here to use this film as a springboard for wider cultural studies and learning. And as we wrap up, the concluding imagery of the film, without giving anything away, students should really consider the creative choices regarding the ending and the concluding images of the film. What impression might the filmmaker be attempting to leave us with? What does the ending suggest about Mona and her classmates' futures? What challenges perhaps still lie ahead for these characters? And lastly, a possible exercise or assessment that students could be set, which I know has been particularly popular in the past for language classes, would be to encourage students to read and critically engage with published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own, drawing on both their close analysis of the film and utilizing the terminology that I've outlined throughout the presentation. This is an excerpt just from one particular review of the film. The review is actually in German, so again, for German language classes, this might be an opportunity for an assessment of translation that I have also attempted to translate a section of, which reads, "The film appears extremely authentic and is told with a cool street credibility that never comes across as trying or pandering. Soline tries to fill the frame of a sports film as full and energetically as possible, and she succeeds in presenting all of the film's characters as complex and believable characters. This is particularly notable when it comes to teachers, because in other films for children and young people, the adults are usually incompetent, authoritarian, or ridiculous. But in Winners, the camera also goes into the teacher's room, and no one is drawn as a caricature there. On the contrary, the sports teacher, Mr. Che, is one of the heroes of the film. He's the teacher who can recognise students' talents and inspire them. Soline Youssef also avoids cliches when drawing on Mona's family. The harmonious cast, including the supporting roles, the authentic setting, which makes the film partly seem like a study of the environment, and the positive attitude to life that it conveys, make Winners an extraordinary children's and youth film. One could also say a real winner. There you go. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, just head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very pleasurable and educationally productive viewing at this year's festival. Thanks so much.